Welcome to Clinical Trial Blazers, a podcast by Paraxel Biotech, where we dive deep into the journeys of industry leaders who are shaping clinical research and biotech innovation. I am your host, Alberto Grignolo. Today on Clinical Trial Blazers, my guest is Dr. Briggs Morrison, a physician-scientist turned biotech CEO who has spent his career at the intersection of clinical development, strategy, and innovation. Briggs is currently the CEO of Crossbow Therapeutics, where he is leading the development of next-generation precision immunotherapies to treat cancer. What makes Briggs' journey especially compelling is his breadth of experience. Following a fellowship in oncology at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Briggs began in clinical development roles at Merck and Pfizer. He proceeded to take on increasingly senior leadership positions, ultimately serving as Chief Medical Officer and Head of Global Medicines Development at AstraZeneca, where he oversaw large, complex portfolios on a global scale. From there, he transitioned into biotech, becoming CEO of Syndax Pharmaceuticals and now CEO at Crossbow. His perspective spans the full arc, from early clinical development decisions to the realities of building and financing a biotech company. Briggs, a very warm welcome to you. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you, Alberto.
You've had a very impressive career trajectory from clinical medicine to leadership roles at major pharmaceutical companies to CEO roles at Syndax and Crossbow, in addition to several bold roles that you now have. What inspired you to transition from working within large organizations to leading two smaller ones?
So it's an interesting story. When I first left academia, I actually was initially interested in the small company world. A very good friend of mine was founding a privately held biotech in Boston. And at the time, my wife, we were newly married, had 3 little kids. She wasn't quite so comfortable with that level of risk of working for a privately held biotech company. So she said, look, if you want to do drug development, that's great. Why don't we go to a company that's been around for a few years? So I went to Merck, which had been around for 100 years. And it was actually the perfect place for me to start my career. The reason I went to small companies is later in life, our kids were all out of the house, and it was my wife and I. And she said, look, I know you had always wanted to do sort of a small company startup kind of thing. And we're at a stage in our life where I'm more comfortable with that risk. So that's what was allowed me to work with my MPM colleagues to go to Syndax. And then once I was in the small company environment, I've really enjoyed it and moved on to Crossbow.
How did your experiences in big pharma shape your vision for Syndax and now Crossbow?
So look, I think everybody in our industry, whether in big companies or small companies, we all really have the same mission, and that is to invent and develop medicines that are going to benefit patients, right? And what I found in the large companies was that the real driving force for progress is the project team. People come from various disciplines, and they all come together and they work on a molecule to drive that molecule through to hopefully regulatory approval, post-marketing studies, launch, et cetera. But it's that project team that really drives. And then around that project team, you have governance and you have functions and you have all the other things that large companies have. And I tend to think of these small companies as being a project team. We don't have the governance and the structures and the matrix and all the other things that we have, but we do have the exact same mission. And it's a small group of people focused on driving that 1 or 2 projects. So I think the main thing that shaped my vision for Syndax and Crossbow is we have to have that all in it together project team focus on we're advancing this 1 program or 2 programs, sometimes 3 programs. And that's what we're about.
Were there any specific challenges or gaps that you observed in large pharma that motivated you to create different kinds of solutions to benefit patients in biotech?
I think the gap is really in the patient population you're willing to serve. I do think that small companies are more willing to go after smaller patient populations, and the 2 programs that we did at Syndax were definitely smaller patient populations. You may be familiar, there's some data I recently saw that more than half of the FDA-approved therapies over the past decade come from small companies, despite having a lot less resources than big companies. I ran into a recent book called Inside the Box. So a lot of us talk about thinking outside the box. the author, the guy's name is David Epstein, says you should think inside the box, that constraints actually drive productivity and efficiency and delivery. And I do think that the small company world, I'm not saying that it was really, at least at Syndax, it wasn't novel technology. Crossbow, it is. Syndax, it wasn't really novel technology, but I do think that constraint, the financial constraint, the resource constraint, I think does focus you and maybe makes you a little bit more productive.
That's a fascinating insight. Let me explore that a bit more. Is it the case, perhaps, that large pharma has not infinite resources, but certainly very extensive resources? And so they are thinking more outside the box because they're not constrained by resources, whereas a small company, as you say, is constrained by more limited resources and has to think inside the box. So is there a different behaviors driven by just the availability of funding in different orders of magnitude?
There's definitely different orders of magnitude. When I was at both Pfizer and AstraZeneca, I ran the committee that would give capital to teams to progress their programs. So it was, the investment committee. Once we gave them their capital, we agreed on a plan, and this is how much money you get, and this is what you need to get done. They only had to come back to the committee if they were over budget or behind on their deliverables. Otherwise, they were good to go. And I do think that constraint is what helps them to just stay focused on what it is they need to do. So I do think constraints help both in big companies and small companies. I just think the constraint is a little tighter in the small company. And I will say over the years, as you pointed out in introduction, I have sat on boards, and sometimes boards of small companies that are funded a little bit too well in the early days, they aren't quite as focused because they have a lot of money. A lot of the venture folks like to tranche their investments. You do this, and then we'll give you more money. If you don't do this, you don't get any more money. I think that constraint sharpens people's focus on both strategy and delivery.
It's no secret, as you hinted, that Big Pharma for decades now has been looking to small biotechs for innovation. And
Yes.
they've acquired assets or entire small companies to have access to those assets, and seeing that innovation has really blossomed in smaller environments with financial constraints, as you mentioned.
There are certain things that within the large company, they can do very, very well. Obviously, late development, commercialization, particularly global commercialization, that's never going to be the forte of a small company. The whole concept of risk taking and the small companies going after either novel targets or novel technology. I actually think for my days in pharma, they were pretty comfortable letting the small companies do that. And to your point, let them take that risk with somebody else's capital. And if it looks promising, we're happy to jump in, but we allocate our capital more towards things that have a higher probability. But that's okay. Everybody's doing fine in the ecosystem.
I'd like to ask you about your leadership style and mindset. Moving from a large corporate environment to entrepreneurship often requires a shift in mindset and leadership style. What skills or lessons or pivotal experiences from your time in large pharma have been most valuable to you in your role as a CEO in biotech?
First of all, what I would call the Merck mindset. Anybody who's ever worked for the U.S. Merck, sometimes referred to as MSD in some parts of the world, there is this famous George Merck quote, and it's something along the lines of, we try never to forget that medicine is for the people, it's not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we remember that, they've never failed to appear. And anybody who's ever worked at Merck knows that quote, knows that philosophy. I'd say the other most pivotal experience for me was really working for Pascal Soriot at AZ. I think Pascal, clearly the best CEO I ever had the good fortune to work with. And there were two key lessons I took from Pascal that I try to build into both Syndax and Crossbow. And the first we've already talked a little bit about, which is focus and execution. We tried to have one set of global objectives for everybody in the company. So everybody was aligned around the same things. We had key areas of focus that the entire company was focused on delivering. And, we really watched execution. There were execution matrix. They were tracked carefully. And so that to me was a good lesson in how to run a big company, which I brought to a small company. The second thing that was a Pascal, I learned a lot, is a phrase he used to use a lot, which some people liked, some people didn't. I was very inspired by it. We're a team, not a family. And what he meant by that is, if you think about a sports team, the obligation of the sports team is try to get the absolute best players on that team to work together to win games. And his view is a corporation is a similar entity. We're a team. We have to get the best people on the field, and we have lots of competitors, and it's our responsibility to try to win. The other part of that is you have to hug your superstars. The thing that I worry most about, I have to say, every single day in a small company is that my superstars might leave. That would be the death knell of a small company. We really rely on having absolutely critical talent. And it's a very competitive environment in which we work. And there are people constantly trying to steal my talented employees. So that's what I've tried to do at both Syndax and Crossbow: focus on patients, develop medicines that matter, and be objective about that people management thing. It's so critical to our companies.
I like a philosophy that says people will do their best work when they feel valued, respected, and supported.
Absolutely.
And I'm reminded of that in listening to you, and that sounds like you want your superstars to, possibly everyone in your organizations, to feel valued, respected, supported, without having them ask you to be valued, respected, supported.
Exactly. I think that's very well said, Alberto.
Is there anything you had to unlearn from Big Pharma to lead effectively in a smaller biotech setting? Anything you had to just put to the side and say, okay, that's not going to work here?
Well, so I think the main thing you have to sort of unlearn is the bureaucracy. And so I think the thing that you have to learn, I had to learn in going to a small company, is that, for want of a better safety net of the bureaucracy that actually checks everything that you do, it's no longer there. Having a small team of people who make decisions rapidly, that again I do think is potentially a big benefit in the small companies. You can make decisions rapidly. So I think the main thing to unlearn is that large committee, everybody gets involved kind of thing, and you just have to make decisions and move.
Yeah, a leader that does not decide for a long time is not leading, are they?
Exactly.
A leader that continuously asks for opinions, inputs, insights, etc., and just does not make a decision, that's not serving the organization well. Would you agree?
My favorite definition of leadership is the act of taking a group of people to a place they would not have gone to on their own. And so if you leave it to them, it's not going to happen. You have to take them. And in order to take them, you've got to make a decision, and you have to say, this is where we're going. When I first joined AstraZeneca, when Pascal came in as CEO, he did have a different, very, I thought, refreshing and exciting way of how he wanted to lead the company. But it was different from the way the company had been led previously. And he basically said, let's make sure everybody understands what we're about, and then you can sign up or not sign up.
As a leader, how do you set priorities when everything feels urgent? And what does good look like for your team?
There is one little trick that I learned from a gentleman I used to work for at Merck named Stephen Friend. So Stephen had this, I thought, very interesting approach to this question of how do you prioritize? This is back in the old days when we all had little spiral-bound notebooks where we kept our notes. But at the beginning of the week, he would draw 2 circles on the top of the page. And those were the 2 things he wanted to get done that week. And if you were in one of those circles, you knew it because he was all over you and something had to get done. And conversely, if you weren't in one of those circles, you couldn't get his attention because that's not what he was working on that week. You might be in the circle next week. And so I've tried that over the years of just saying, look, this week I have to do these 2 things. Again, I think at a small company, it's not as hard, but in large companies, the 2-circle thing really helped. So the company I'm running now, I'm both the CEO and the CMO. We have trying to be as capital efficient as we can. So there were times where there were CEO things that had to get done, and I had to draw the 2 circles. That's what I try to do to prioritize prioritize my time.
Staying with your leadership style, I'd like to turn to managing risk. We both know very well that there are scientific and operational risks in getting from a promising biology to a real therapy that helps patients and ultimately drives profits. How do you personally de-risk drug development, essentially, in clinical trials?
Something a friend of mine taught me, the ABCs of biotech. Always be in the clinic. And what that basically means is there is no preclinical experiment ever done in the history of man that's going to de-risk a product. So whatever we're doing to reassure ourselves and build, conviction that it just isn't that predictive. So you have no choice but always be in the clinic. And then in the clinic, it's, again, I think the general rule is test your agent in the population where you think you have the absolute best chance of seeing your agent work. If it doesn't work there, move on.
In a small company, people often have very few assets, and they might be reluctant to discontinue development. Do you have that reluctance? Do you not have that reluctance? How do you deal with, okay, we need to move on, we're going to cancel this and turn our attention and money to something else?
It's important in the early days that you set the goalposts of what it is you want your product to do. And some people refer to this as a target product profile or what have you, and then constantly evaluate as you're developing your product. Does it look like it's going to hit the goalpost? Our industry is filled with anecdotes of stories of molecules that everybody thought was going to die, and then somebody came along with this brilliant idea and rescued it and saved it. Those are, in my experience, more the exception than the rule. I think the more general rule is great drugs declare themselves early. And so I think set the goalposts, just be very objective. Did you hit the goalpost or didn't you? I mean, it's back to our team analogy. Now, I do think your point of companies having a small number of shots, if you will, and if they miss the net, sometimes that's the end of the story. That's true in large companies as well. We do it all the time. And then it's very interesting because in large companies, you miss the net and the team members will get assigned to another project. So I worked on multiple projects when I was in large companies. In the small biotech world, you miss the net and the company shuts down and you go work for a different company. But that's okay. I don't think people should be too concerned about that.
There are many, many more stories of compounds and approaches that should have worked and didn't.
Absolutely.
All the science was pointing in that direction, but it did not work in the clinic. Those are more common. Would you agree?
Those are absolutely more common. And so that's why you just have to, I think, just have to be very objective of what is it we're trying to accomplish. And step back to this. I once heard somebody say, if the medicine were available, would it be malpractice not to prescribe it? I thought that was a very nice way of framing just how important is this medicine that you're working on.
Drug development takes a lot of money, as we know, so let's talk a little bit about money. You're a physician, you turn CEO, and you bring a unique perspective to drug development. You're working in a highly competitive environment. And how did you prepare to raise money at Syndax and Crossbow? How did you learn the language of capital, internal rate of return, risk-adjusted return, structured financing, and others? How did you transition into the world of capital?
The financial metrics I was familiar with, AZ, they actually used to call it bang for the buck. What are we going to get if we invest this money? Return on investment, NPV, ENPVs. So things I sort of had some familiarity with. I still don't know what a structured financing is. My solution to that is to complement my skills with a partner who does know all the financial stuff. And when I started at Syndax, I think the board was absolutely brilliant in hiring both me and essentially my co-CEO, Michael Metzger. And Michael knew all that stuff. He has a finance training background. He was in M&A at Forrest. He's just a fantastic operator. And there were things that he knew that I didn't know. And I tried to learn some of it from him, but I knew I'd never be the expert that he is. And there were things that he didn't know that I knew, and he tried to learn from me, realizing he would never be the expert that I am. It's back to our sports metaphor. It's the team.
You know what you don't know, but you know enough to accomplish the goal. And one goal you accomplished is to raise $77 million in Series B for Crossbow in March. So how was that fundraising process? What was your narrative to the investors? What points, whether data points or milestones, were most compelling to your potential investors?
Yeah. So I would say the financing was very long and very hard. We started raising money during what was still, I think, the more constrained environment. This year seems to be, the capital markets are opening up, and there's more, at least on the public side. We have IPOs, we have acquisitions, things are a little more, but the private side is still a little tight, and it certainly was when we started. So it took us a long time. It was hard, but it does go back to my ABCs. The ABCs will always be in the clinic, and so the thesis for this round of investment for new investors was the clinical readout of our first two programs.
Do you think that your investors or partners initially had reservations about your ability to lead a company, given that you have a medical background rather than a business background? Was that an issue with anybody? If
Absolutely,
so,
100%.
100%.
So when I joined Syndax, I can't imagine there was anybody who would have invested in me to run a biotech company. I think that board and investors thought, he knows drug development, he knows investor relations. There's a lot of investor relations with Pascal. Again, Pascal taught me a tremendous amount about how to do that. Those things, but to build a company and, even just the operational things of where are you going to be located, how are you going to hire people, HR systems, finance systems, all that. That was Michael's area of expertise. And so I think when people came in and met us as a partnership and a team, then they were okay.
Given how crucial your relationship with Michael and cooperation with Michael was, did the board or investors want to dig deeper into that relationship to assess how stable is it? Are you guys really collaborative with each other? Are there any risks that either of you could walk away and thereby placing the investment at risk?
Yeah, I give all the credit in the world to the board. It was very clever on their part to bring us in as a team. So Michael and I spent a fair amount of time getting to know each other before either one of us agreed to do this. We had never met before. It's not like we knew each other. So we spent a lot of time getting to know each other, talking about the strategy, talking about who would do what, how we would split things up. And so then I think when the investors asked the question that you just asked, we were both very comfortable answering about our commitment to the company and our commitment to the partnership and our commitment to again, trying to invent and develop important medicines.
Let's talk about differentiation in the market with your products. The Series B announcement highlighted your focus on TCR mimetic antibody therapies. For our audience who may be less familiar with this approach, can you briefly and concisely explain what makes TCR mimetics different from other immuno-oncology approaches?
The way our adaptive immune system works is we have T cells that will recognize peptides that are presented by your HLA complex, and that's part of your immune system. And so TCR mimetic antibodies are antibodies that will recognize peptide HLA the same way that a TCR does. But you do it with an antibody. There are companies who do it with a TCR itself.
So will you have a competitive advantage? Are there any other companies working in the same space with similar approaches that you're going to have to compete with?
So there are two other companies that are about the same stage of development as we are. One is called CDR Life, based in Switzerland, and the other one's called CLASP, based in Boston. We go after different targets, not really competing with each other in terms of the patient populations that we want to treat.
So lots of space to benefit many, many patients in different ways.
Exactly. And that's part of the reason that we started the company is we thought if this is true, that you can go after these, it opens up a whole new set of targets that haven't previously really been amenable to antibody-based therapies. So there's lots and lots of opportunity.
Advice for the next generation based on your experience, looking back on your career, thinking about the emerging biotech leaders who are considering embarking in what you have done. What do you know now that you wish you had known when you first became CEO at Syndax and now Crossbow?
Yeah, I think the thing that I didn't really realize is how hard this is. But once you get into it, you've hired people who agree with your vision and they're trying to build your company. Nobody likes to fail. And yet, as you pointed out earlier, the vast majority of people do fail. It's just the nature of our business. And so I think the main thing that I probably should have just appreciated more is there's a good chance this isn't going to work and you're going to have to go start all over again. As I said in my earlier story, early in my career, my wife, for example, was not comfortable with that level of risk. That's the thing that I probably wish I had known more, understood better, is just this is a very risky undertaking that we take.
In retrospect, are you comfortable with your wife's recommended approach to go to big pharma first and then take high risks? Because others listening to this may say, okay, that's what I'll do also, as opposed to go straight into a small biotech, even as a young professional with a young family.
As I hire people, one of my first questions is, what does your spouse or partner think of this? Because these are family decisions as I live through. My wife is brilliant, and she gives me great advice. We've been married for 41 years, and for me, it worked out perfectly. Merck was a wonderful place. The foundational learning of how to do drug development, the science behind it, the regulatory science, the clinical science, I learned that it was fantastic. So for me, it's worked out perfectly. So if you are going to go into a small biotech, it would just be, my advice to people is just look at the management and who's going to be teaching you.
Final question on clinical trials. You and I first met some 20 years ago in the context of the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, CTTI or CITI. Will AI in the next 2 years transform clinical trials more than CITI has been able to do in 20 years?
What our experience has been with AI is it allows us to understand the breadth of what other people have tried. So what I do think we don't do as good a job in this industry is when somebody does find, I didn't do that, and if the FDA didn't care, and we don't really share those lessons as well. And so I think there are people who push the envelope of how to do things more efficiently, faster, and interestingly, when you use the AI tools to ask, what have people done? I'm not exactly sure where they pull from, but we find a lot of very good examples. And then we'll go to the FDA and say, and they say, yeah. The AI tools just seem to have a reach of what are the examples that people have tried. And that gives me some confidence to try it as well.
That's a very, very exciting times ahead. I certainly agree with that. And sadly for me, we need to bring this conversation to a close. Tremendous insights, wonderful nuggets, very quotable, Briggs, very quotable. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being with us today.
Alberto, it was really a pleasure spending time with you. And I do hope as people watch the podcast that perhaps there's a couple of lessons they can take away in their day-to-day work.
That wraps up this episode of Clinical Trial Blazers. A big thank you to Briggs Morrison, CEO of Crossbow Therapeutics, for joining us today and sharing his perspective on ABC, always be in the clinic, and the company being the entire project team when you are in a small biotech organization. Be sure to join us for upcoming episodes of Clinical Trial Blazers, where we dive into the people and stories driving innovation across biopharma and biotech. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps others discover the show. Clinical Trial Blazers is produced by Parexel Biotech and hosted by me, Alberto Grignolo, with production support from Acast Productions. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious and continue advancing the future of clinical research.